Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Tom Bernes on the subject G20 Summitry. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. My name is Dr. Andrew Thompson. I'm an adjunct assistant professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and senior fellow here at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. Every week, we're joined by an expert in global governance, international public policy, or some other aspect of international affairs here to the studio in Waterloo. I'm very pleased to introduce Tom Bernes. He is a distinguished fellow here at the Centre for International Governance Innovation and the former executive director of the IMF for Canada, Ireland, and parts of the Caribbean. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Andrew.
Tom, I wonder if we could just start broadly for our audience who may not be familiar with the G20. What is it? What is its mandate? And what is its comparative advantage over other institutions or other groupings like the G8?
Well, the G20 is known today as for its meetings at head of government level. But in fact, the original G20 was formed at the Ministers of Finance level back when Paul Martin, in fact, was Minister of Finance in Canada. And at that time, it became clear that with the rise of economic powers like China, like Brazil, that to address economic issues, the G7 or the G8 was no longer, had sufficient inclusiveness to be able to address global issues. And so Paul Martin had foreseen that and worked with the Americans, with others, to create a forum which was larger, which became known as the G20. Right. And in the first years, it was meant to really build confidence amongst the membership so that the people knew each other, so that in the event a crisis arose, they would be able to respond as the G7 had done to previous crises. As things turned out, right, of course, that's precisely what happened. So in 2007, as the financial crisis unfolded, at the initiative of President Bush, then of the United States, and Gordon Brown, Prime Minister of the UK, a decision was made to convene the G20 at heads of government level. And it really was to address economic issues. And it led 2 or 3 meetings later for the G20 to declare that forum as their premier forum for economic cooperation between themselves. And so that's its mandate, is to address global economic issues of importance to the G20 membership, which now encompasses about 95% of global GDP. So even though it's a limited membership, right, in terms of population representation, in terms of global economic representation, it is hugely inclusive, and much more so than the G7, G8, for instance, which you cited. Right.
Now, you recently attended the meeting in Brisbane, Australia. What were your impressions of that meeting? Was there anything that stood out for you?
The Brisbane summit was an attempt to go back to roots, if I can describe it that way. If you look at the success of the G20 at heads of government level, many people give it good credit for its immediate response to the crisis. But after the first few meetings, when they begin to turn to medium-term issues, that sense of need for urgent action seemed to dissipate, and, right, and the agenda broadened out. So in Brisbane, there was an attempt to bring the agenda back and focus on a few key issues. And so that was the attempt. Now, of course, these meetings always get affected by events at the last moment. And so as listeners, viewers may recall, there was a lot of discussion about President Putin of Russia and, right, and how he was treated. So these things will have an effect. But the big thing out of Brisbane was this attempt to return to basics and to have a concrete result.
And perhaps to just build on that, the leaders' communiqué that came out of the meeting had a wide range of issues that it covered. And when I read it, it seemed to be that there was a little bit of there was something for everybody, and it covered youth unemployment, integrating 100 million women into the workforce, climate change, global infrastructure. You mentioned the Ebola crisis. What are your reactions to this plan of action?
One of the challenges, if you go back and look at each communique from each of the G20 heads of government summits, I think the first communique ran somewhere around 1,700 words, if you added them up. I haven't seen a report counting out of Brisbane, but the preceding meeting was approximately 12,000 words.
Okay.
So over the course of time,
right.
as each meeting went on, it becomes called the Christmas tree approach to communique drafting. So
right.
everybody, every country, every leader has their issue, and let's put it in. And so there was an attempt by the Australian presidency to say, no, stop. We've got to have a short communique. So the communique itself was only 3 pages.
Right.
But then, in addition, there are all of these annexes. And the annexes represent the work program of all of the officials from G20 countries during the course of the year and the international institutions that they're involved in. But it's important because it identifies progress
right.
during the course of the year and puts pressure on officials and institutions to deliver. What's problematic about it is that because it becomes such a Christmas tree approach to communicate,
right.
that everything's in there, that it loses focus. And when you try and communicate that to the public, if it represents everything, does it really represent anything? And that's
sure.
the challenge.
So Tom, one of the things that stood out for me in the communique was this commitment to an additional 2% growth in the global economy over the next 5 years. How did they come up with that number? Why not 1% or 4%?
Well, in fact, it was driven by the Australians to begin with, who said one of the problems in their view with the G20 was that the commitment to strong, balanced, and inclusive growth had no target associated with it, and therefore whether the G20 was living up to its ambition could not be measured. And so they suggested this 2% target, which is it magical? Why that rather than 1% or 4%? I think there were some studies that were done by the OECD in particular that suggested that through a series of policy improvements in G20 countries, that was achievable, that growth 5 years hence could be 2% higher than it would otherwise have been.
Right.
Those are easy words to say, not quite easy to get your mind around, because a lot of commentators in Brisbane kept asking about that. But the idea was that countries would identify new policy measures they would take to get to that target. So these could not be, in theory, things that they had announced before, put on the table before. These were supposed to be new and additional measures. And as I said in Brisbane, the key question is going to be implementation of
right.
those reforms which they announced. And if there's an art to communicate drafting, and if you look at it and what it says, you look at the language, it said these measures, if fully implemented, can achieve an additional 2% growth. So it's
right.
the if fully implemented. And of course, leaders made their announcement, released their communique, flew out of Brisbane, and the actual measures themselves didn't get released until a couple of hours after they had all gone. And in fact, if you look at it, you'll see that frankly, a lot of the measures that were announced, I mean, somebody's dream list. It would be nice if they could happen. But I mean, one of them, for instance, to give one example, is comprehensive immigration reform in the United States.
Right.
That was one of the things they said, we're going to do. Well, is there a problem? Yes. Do they need to do something? Yes. Do we really think there's going to be comprehensive immigration reform in the next couple of years? Highly unlikely. Not impossible, but highly unlikely. If you look at you go through every country, it's like that. And so the objective was important. It was an attempt to get countries to make specific commitments in order to achieve greater growth, which would provide more jobs, address the unemployment problem. Right. The institutions, the IMF and the OECD, were tasked to provide a report for next year in terms of how are countries faring up to implementing the commitments they made. And that's going to be the test, because the report will presumably say we're 0% there, 2% there. And then what are countries going to do about that? And that will be a real test. Are countries prepared to push and cajole each other in order to implement the measures which they identified?
Right. Well, and perhaps projecting forward, the government of Turkey has identified implementation as one of the key pillars for the upcoming meeting this year in November in Turkey. Is this just rhetoric, or can the G20 actually enforce some of these standards that have been set, or these promises that have been made?
Oh, it's a good question, Andrew. No, I mean, the G20 has no enforcement powers per se. It's an informal grouping. It's not an institution. They rely on other institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, to carry out their work. But again, this has been a criticism of the G20, which is we've been through 7 of them, 8 of them now. They keep building up the commitments. We don't need new commitments. We need to implement what's already being committed. And so this is a cry we're hearing more and more, which is let's focus on implementation. The Australians talked about it, and I think Turkey has picked up that theme. But we'll see.
Right. So Tom, again, projecting ahead to the next meeting in November, how much influence does the host government have in shaping the agenda?
No, the host government has a big role in shaping the agenda. It's not a total role. I mean, obviously, what's in the communiqué from Brisbane, for instance, will broadly define the agenda for the meeting in Turkey. But it's on the margin that the chair, through the work during the course of the year and through the actual meeting, can shape to give greater prominence to some issues or lesser prominence to others. To use an example, the issue of climate change. Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister of Australia, made it clear during the course of the year and going to the meetings he did not want climate change on the agenda. Right. He said we're going to focus on economic growth in a narrow sense. When we arrived in Brisbane, of course, what happened is President Obama had been in China, United States and China made this announcement of an agreement on emissions. The President Obama flew into Brisbane and said, this is a global issue, we need to address it. The pressure became so great that it found itself reflected in the communique. So there's an example where even if the host wanted an issue off, he couldn't stop it. Right. On the other hand, Tony Abbott identified earlier, he said he wanted a short 3-page communique. He got that. He wanted a principal focus on economic growth with some specific objectives, the 2% additional growth. Right. And he got that. So the host does not have total control, but certainly can influence the course of events. Right.
And perhaps just to wrap up, the G20 is now about 7 years old. Can we say, that this has been what its value added to the global governance architecture has been, particularly in the areas of finance and economics?
I think we can draw some conclusions which are not the final result, but one, it is a more inclusive grouping than anything that existed before. Right. And so the BRICS, China, Brazil, South Africa, you hear a lot less complaints these days than you did with the G7, G8, which many argued was not representative. So that is an achievement, that we have a forum which is broadly accepted as being generally representative. Right. Secondly, I think it is credited with responding to the financial crisis of 2008 in a solid and cooperative way. The damage could have been much, much worse. They stopped the crisis, they stopped the decline, and there was a collective focus on that. And I think most commentators will give the G20 credit for that. And so it is a forum that is more representative globally. It has proven its ability to come together to fight a crisis. What the challenge today is if there's no crisis, can they come together to successfully address medium-term issues? Right. And that's what is the big question mark. During a crisis, everybody is on the same page. They focus, leaders focus. The 2008 crisis was every leader's worst domestic crisis issue. Right. If you go today, you have, different crises in different countries. You've got different political cycles. It's hard to get everybody on the same page, and so that's been the test before of institutions such as this, and it'll be a big test for the G20 whether they can develop a medium-term program that they can demonstrate to the public is working, because if they can't do that, the public will lose interest, leaders will lose interest, and then it will lose its ability to influence events in the future.
Tom, thank you so much for being on the program. This has been wonderful.
Andrew, pleasure.
And thank you to our audience for tuning in. You've been watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CIGI Online podcast. Look for us online at cgionline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.